Right. The older I get, the more I realize that although I still think I'm quite young and sometimes even a naughty teenager, but then I realize that there are certain things that people's memories are a bit different from mine. So 1978 was when Louise Brown was born to a woman called Leslie Brown, who died in June this year. So Louise Brown, 34. So for those of you who were not born in 1978, Louise Brown was the first test tube baby. And she was welcomed into the world by Pope John Paul I, which gesture and act was often misinterpreted. But we'll come back to that. I think it was Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, and she set up a royal commission under a Baroness Mary Warnock, who herself was a philosopher from Oxford, a remarkable generation of philosophers. She and then Elizabeth Anscombe, after whom the Anscombe Institute in Oxford is named, Elizabeth Anscombe, well, certainly the foremost Catholic philosopher of the 20th century, not only in the Anglo-Saxon world. And the other one was Philippa Foot, the three of them foremost Catholic, not all of them Catholic. Elizabeth was the only Catholic, but formidable women philosophers. So Baroness Warnock was put in charge of this Royal Commission to look into the whole question of in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer, IVF and ET. So the popular name was test tube babies. And I, as still a relatively young layman, and Bishop Mario knew I'd done a degree in philosophy many years before, somehow thought I would be a suitable lay candidate to be on what was the first joint venture between the Bishops' Conference of Scotland, the English and Welsh bishops, and the Irish bishops. For the first time they came together on something and set up something called the Joint Committee on Bioethical Issues. And the first thing we had to do was to prepare a report, a Catholic Church's response to this inquiry on in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer. So, in one sense, John Paul I was welcoming a new human being into the world. However, Louise Brown had been conceived, and there are many people brought into the world in less than ideal circumstances, out of wedlock or whatever. And so we respect and welcome all human beings. But it's a wholly different question of whether or not it is acceptable from a Catholic moral perspective, or even from a human perspective, in the sense in which the bishop has outlined the vision and then the principles that derive from that vision. If somebody is infertile, then we have great compassion on them, and we try and do everything that we can to overcome that infertility. And as the book of Sirach reminded us, we, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have a great respect for the medical sciences in order to restore something that has gone wrong in nature. But I'm going to argue in a moment that in this instance it's not restoring something in nature, it is wholly bypassing it. And now there are many things that are artificial and So my spectacles give me sort of aid to my sight, and therefore, in a sense, that's artificial, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's fine. But in this matter of human reproduction, what are the questions? Well, first of all, we've got this wonderful vision of what a human being is and what a human person is. But one of the things I would like to just draw your attention to for a moment is that very many people argue a human person is somebody who is capable of thought, reflection, choice, love, etc. And they have a sort of dualist idea of what a human being is, and therefore they would argue that until someone is capable of these things, they're not truly human. And there are some philosophers at the extreme who argue that, and would argue that somebody in a comatose state is no longer human. The Christian viewpoint is very, very clear, arising partly through our doctrine of the resurrection of the body. We have a respect for the animal in us. We are animals, we are rational animals. We share a lot with the rest of the non-rational animal kingdom, but so we're that much greater than it, but the biological, the physical, the animal part of us, we respect, and there's nobody in this room that did not begin as a zygote arising out of the meeting of the gametes of your parents and an exchange of the nuclei of the two cells, the spermatozoon and the ovum, which is, we now know, which we didn't know in 1978. In fact, fertilization happens in a moment. There were many who used to argue that, oh, it was a 24-hour, 48-hour process, and therefore, if you say it's from the moment of conception, well, there isn't such a moment, a moment of fertilization. There isn't such a moment. Well, we now know there is. And our life, our bodily life, began there long before there's a brain structure capable of being the basis for our thought, etc. But it's part of our biological life, and life is a continuum from there until, well, I was going to say until natural death, but it's not, because it's actually, after that, immortal, because at the resurrection of the body, in whatever form, mysterious and glorious, our bodies will be restored to us. So that remains part of our nature. So anything that is something that would destroy human embryos goes clearly against the one principle. If we have this marvelous vision of what a human being is, that the bishop outlined, the first principle that we can elaborate in a very clear way is, and it's a moral absolute, and there aren't that many moral absolutes, but this is one of them: it is always, in all circumstances, wrong, absolutely, without qualification, directly to take any innocent human life. Innocent meaning not harming, not intentionally harming. And I've got to tease that out a bit, because there are those who say, for example, if a woman has a pregnancy where her life is threatened in some way, or her health is just threatened by the baby, that is harming her. That's not what we mean. Innocent, in the Latin sense, is not harming, but we mean not intentionally harming. And that's an absolute principle, but a principle which remains open to the idea that you have a right to defend yourself against an aggressor in war, etc., because they are not innocent, they are intentionally trying to harm you. So that's an absolute principle. And destroying embryos, therefore, is the destruction of human life. destroying a fellow human being, however microscopic. And so that's very clear. So that one principle really rules out of itself every IVF program that exists in any part of the world, whether it's Australia, here, the States, China, because there are none of them that do not involve destruction of embryos, spare embryos. In fact, lots of programs are in fact set up, I think I'm safe to say this on camera, with a view to producing lots of spare embryos being used for all sorts of other nefarious ends, namely trying to improve abortifacient contraceptives, etc., etc., etc. So if we hold to that principle about we can never take the life of a fellow human being, that just rules it out. But nonetheless, there was this question, and I remember getting on my knees on the sleeper to my first meeting of that bioethical commission, praying, let's hope there are no liberal theologians with weird ideas on this committee, but also, what about the difficult case where you've got just a husband and wife involved, and in theory, you're not going to destroy any embryos, right? Just the one you're going to fertilize in the Petri dish and put that back in the mother's fallopian tube, or beyond the point where it was obstructed or whatever it is that okay? And that was actually quite a difficult one. And there were many on the committee, some monsignores, who would say, oh, well, we haven't got enough to go on. Let's not be a closed-mind church. Let's wait for Rome to speak. In fact, I think the principles were already quite clear for those people who, like me, had to struggle with the idea of the principles of humanae vitae against contraception. There was a time when I didn't accept that, but I was jolted by, in fact, a philosopher at Aberdeen University who had gone very much into the question of, is it legitimate for a country to threaten with nuclear weapons any other country, just to possess even nuclear weapons? And he came to the conclusion, no, it was against Catholic principles, and I agreed thoroughly with him on that. And then he challenged me, well, if you agree with that, why don't you agree on these other questions of Catholic teaching? And I'm afraid that was a big jolt to me, and I had to look into it a lot more closely. And it was the teaching of John Paul II, particularly his body on love, his book on love and responsibility, as well as his catecheses at that time on the theology of the body, that changed my mind on that. So what is that principle? It is going to one of the bishop's ises, and that is, what is it that a marriage is and the marital act? And is there a givenness to the structure of it and its meaning? And I've got very, very little time. So just to put it in its condensest form, when a husband and wife are making love, then what their body language is saying, I give myself to you completely, unreservedly, holding nothing back, and you're giving yourself to me wholly, unreservedly, holding nothing back, and this is what our bodies are saying. And that includes the possibility, just the possibility, that you may become the father and mother of a child that comes about from our lovemaking. And it is only a possibility. John Paul actually said, if you were exercising the marital act, if you're making love, with the sole purpose, regardless of the feelings of, say, the wife, of having a child, then that is not wholly a moral act. It's got to be respectful of the other, it's got to be expressing your love, and it can only be the hope of a child. Because a child is a gift from God, and we're not wholly in control of that. And that's where the equality of all of us comes from. We are all God's gifts, and we have an equality with our parents that derive from the fact that we are gifts. And if, therefore, I do anything either before or during or after our lovemaking that contradicts that unqualified giving of myself to my spouse, it makes what we're doing a lie. It's an offense against the commandment against truth-telling more than anything else, because you're then doing something that contradicts what your body is saying. And if you understand at least that much about it, then you've got enough to go on to answer the question, is it all right wholly to bypass that act which is potentially procreative in order to bring a human being into the world? And it's not just a question of, well, the sperm has got through masturbation, therefore it's wrong. It's much deeper than that. It's a question of who are the principal agents in bringing this child into the world. It's not the mother and the father in any way. The principal agents are the people in the laboratory working at this Petri dish. In the case of Louise Brown, I think it's Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards, a physiologist and an obstetrician. And that remains true then and now. And so hard as it might seem to somebody who is infertile, you're wholly replacing the context in which God intended each of us to come into the world. And so it offends the principle of the natural context, and the only legitimate context for coming into the world is as the result of the lovemaking, the self-giving of a husband and wife. And those are the criteria which allow us to discount this completely. You know, there was already earlier teaching by Pius XII on what's called heterologous and homologous artificial insemination. The former is where you have an ovum and a sperm, and they come from, it could be from one of the spouses, and then somebody from outside the marriage. It can be anybody, and that's called heterologous. Homologous would be artificial insemination by the husband. It's only the husband's sperm that is used, and only the wife's ovum. But even that was discounted by Pius XII, basically for the same reasons as I've just outlined, that it's not the act of the two parents that are going to be the key act that brings about fertilization and a new human being into the world. Now, IVF has moved on in different ways. It's got more precise in some ways. It's done huge harm because it's spawned an industry of embryos which sit in fridges all over the world, all our hospitals. And it just goes on and on and on. And I was very struck by the bishop telling us the translation for the devil was man killer. And that is, it makes what's going on demonic. And it is going on. There are other ways of helping infertile couples. If an ovum is moved beyond a fallopian blockage in such a way that then natural intercourse takes place, there seems to be nothing wrong with that, and I think that's called gift. But another distortion of IVF is very often when people come for infertility treatment, they're not even told the precision with which we can now identify the fertile moments in the month when a woman is maximally fertile, because that's just no longer part of, seemingly common knowledge. Now, perhaps I'm traducing medics, and that's no longer true, but it used to be the case. And so I've got to be careful what I say on camera. But I've run into 25 minutes, so should I stop there?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Excellent.
Right.